Hello, Isha.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
Technical hiccups.
It's the internet.
It was the internet. While working on a recent project, John became withdrawn and no longer contributed in discussions related to the project he was managing. John's client Jennifer had pointed out, in a sharp tone, the shortcomings in his contribution, and he felt criticized. He did not want to expose himself to any further humiliation and reacted by holding back on voicing any further contributions. Having been coached, though, it was self empathy that helped John acknowledge his feelings of being criticized. It helped him to take a moment before responding defensively to Jennifer. It also gave him the opportunity to understand why Jennifer was speaking in a sharp tone and that the tone wasn't motivated by criticism towards him, but was born out of her own feeling of pressure and exhaustion. This is a story told to me once by Dr. Katherine Train, and we will understand more about what happened here by learning about the topic for today, which is self empathy. Hello, everybody. To everyone live with us today, thank you all for joining in, and a very warm welcome to our regular audience, and of course, to those who are joining us for the first time as well. Allow me to tell you a little about TLR Now. TLR Now is a niche coaching, training, and mentoring service provider based out of Pune in India. TLR Shows, which we are on right now, is a place where we bring some incredible people who inspire us to go above and beyond. So, welcome to the 68th edition of TLR Shows, everyone. I am Isha Vikram, a trainer in early childhood education and your host for the next hour. I worked in the cultural sector in Belgium, and my goal in life is to introduce empathy in early childhood with the mission to make the world a more respectful and tolerant place to live in. So, well, I am always open to meaningful collaborations to spread the message of empathy across the world. And that brings me to our guest for today, Dr. Katherine Train. Katherine is an independent practitioner and researcher. Since 2005, she's been researching, developing learning materials, and presenting training on professional development, well being, presence, empathy, compassion fatigue, and burnout in various sectors. Her research interest has been in the application of empathy in organizations, and she holds a PhD from the Graduate School of Business in University of Cape Town. Together with Dr. Lidewij Niezink, she founded Empathic Intervision to develop evidence-based empathy interventions and education. So, everyone, today is this is an episode all about noticing, recognizing, and working with self in order to empathize with others. And of course, we will talk about Katherine's dedication to the field of empathy. So, welcome to the show, Katherine.
Thank you very much, Isha. And thank you also to TLR Shows for the invitation to be here. It's great to be here.
Definitely. It's our pleasure. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. I'm down right in the south of Africa, South Africa, Cape Town, and very hot. So very hot, but also very excited to be here and to speak to your listeners.
Perfect. I am hoping that our conversation is going to be as hot and happening as it is there in Cape Town right now.
Yeah, we have so. And also really excited to hear your very noble mission about making the better world, and particularly through childhood, where we're able to make difference in people's lives.
Thank you very much. I hope we're able to take it forward in a fashion that it really does have an impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. So fantastic. So let's dive in then.
Let's do that.
Okay. So
yeah.
Let me begin with a very basic question. And I am sure you would have heard this question or at least thought about it a lot of times. What does empathy mean to you?
So empathy to me is about being able to hold a space for other people in order to allow themselves to represent themselves And in order to be able to understand more about their own experience, be their feelings, their thoughts, but from their own context or their own perspective. So very important, it's about being able to know how it is for them in their own context, and also given, you know, things about their life, about their own circumstances. And particularly to be able to hold a space for them to express that in order that a person can get more of an understanding about them.
Okay. Okay. So this is how you define empathy. I see there are a lot of words that we might delve into later because there's so much to understand. Um, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And so I hope our audience also got an insight into what empathy means to you. I know that Empathic Intervision, your organization, co-founded with Dr. Lidewij Niezink, you have categorized empathy into five, but we will save that conversation for another day for sure because it's very important to talk about all of them. Today's conversation is all about self-empathy. So let's delve a little deeper into that. Does that sound good to you?
Yes, yes. So I think people often think that self-empathy is a contradiction,
Yeah.
you know, as we've discussed earlier, because empathy is really about the other person,
Right.
and yet whatever one is doing, it actually does start with self. So absolutely, for us, self-empathy is very much a starting point for empathizing with other people.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah.
So I hear you say that in common understanding, we empathize with the other person, and the self in empathy therefore seems like a contradiction, as you said. So what do you mean when you say self empathy, and why is the self so important in empathy?
So what we mean by self-empathy is, so there's just maybe as an introduction, it's self-empathy has been introduced quite a lot in the context of therapy. So often when a therapist is working with a client, they will encourage self-empathy in the client in order that the client becomes kind of more aware of their own inner life and able to understand their own inner life and their own motivations. For our context, though, we're looking at self-empathy in the context of empathizing with others, so not as a therapeutic intervention. And what we mean by that is drawing one's attention, so from the outside world into one's inner world. And by that we mean the world of experience and also the world of thoughts and feelings and also bodily sensations. So anything that is happening inside of oneself in terms of, you know, if you were to look, to reflect and look inside of you, as opposed to drawing your attention outward to the world of objects or people around you. So that is, it's in a sense being able to observe one's own inner experiences and to be able to understand more about what's going on inside there. And also to do it in an empathic manner. So that is with an intention to understand more about yourself from your perspective. So that would be perhaps given certain circumstances, certain life in, you know, the environment that you're in a particular moment. How do you actually understand that inner experience? And how it's relevant to empathy is that when we're empathizing with other people, a lot of things are stimulated inside of us as well. So it's, you know, how do you actually know what's going on inside of yourself in order to be able to empathize with other people? Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So then, how does self empathy differ from self compassion or self love and many other self concepts, so to say?
Yeah, so I think, you know, they very often are confused. And so empathy and compassion also is quite often confused. Also empathy and sympathy is confused. The thing with empathy, it's about, I mean, if you, I quite often like to look at the root of words to understand a little bit more about it. And if you look at path, so for empathy, M is to go into, pathos is the Greek word for feeling. So empathy is about going into feeling in order to, and experience in order to understand it. Compassion, on the other hand, is about suffering. So that's from the Latin word pati, is suffering. So the big difference, the sort of kind of more broad difference is that empathy is about all experience.
Yeah.
So self-empathy about all experience of self, whereas compassion is much more focused on the suffering component of it, of one's experience. And then with self-compassion, one is bringing into one's own experience, you are kind of being with your own suffering, and with the intention to do something about it, to possibly alleviate the suffering, to help be with the suffering.
So then self-compassion does not help one be compassionate to others, is it?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear.
So then self-compassion does not essentially help one be compassionate to others, is that so?
So it would have a different focus. From my experience, and particularly working with people in a coaching kind of context, and also people, I've done quite a lot of work with healthcare practitioners, social services. And what you find is, and particularly in our South African context where a lot of my research and practice has happened, is that people are quite often suffering from similar experiences to those they're working with. Perhaps, difficult life experiences, or in certain situations, death of family members or whatever it might be. And if you're not compassionate to self and you're not really caring for yourself in that way, then it is very difficult to be compassionate with other people. Okay. So I think there is both with self-empathy and empathy, and also self-compassion and compassion, a link. If one is not caring for self and one is, suffering, it's very difficult to then shift your focus away from your own distress into the experience of somebody else.
Right.
If you're feeling burnt out or compassion fatigue, it's very difficult to be compassionate with other people. Yeah, so there's a link in that way. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So earlier, sometime in our conversation, not in this conversation, but earlier, in some of our conversations we've had, I heard you mention that self-empathy does not mean that you need to change yourself. And what do you mean when by that?
Yeah, so when one empathizes, and also, similarly, when one empathizes with oneself, and particularly the way that perhaps just to say here is that there are different people who interpret empathy in different ways. So when I speak, I'm speaking about, my particular interpretation, and also how we work with it in our organization and with our practice. But for us, the intention in empathy is not about changing. So if you're empathizing with somebody else, the element of empathy is not with an intention to change. That might move into another intention to do something else. And so similarly with self-empathy, the intention is not to change. The intention is to become aware of and to accept what is going on there. And again, one of the other elements that we apply in self-empathy is about suspending judgment. So it's quite a natural kind of human tendency to judge. We judge all the time. And sometimes when empathizing oneself, you might find an awareness of something, and then also a judgment about self might come up. But the intention, again, is not to change it, but just to notice the judgment and to suspend it. Yeah.
Okay. And even, so how does one understand if one needs to suspend judgment? How does one understand the intentions then?
Well, you would go into it with an intention. So we now, we have a practice of self-empathy. So what we've done is we have looked at it from various research that we've done, and also just looking at how it works in people we've worked with. We have identified various practices according to self-empathy as we define it, and one of those would be about practicing the suspension of judgment. Yeah. And also, something else that happens is very often when one is trying too hard to change something, it can also reinforce that thing that you're trying to change. So if one has a tendency to judge oneself and you kind of asserting effort to try and stop it, it can tend to reinforce. Whereas if you're just noticing, so one's thoughts and feelings, they have almost like waves, they come and go.
Right.
And the more you stick on it or fix it, the more it becomes almost obnoxious and sticks. Whereas if you go with it, you notice it, and you allow it to flow over you, it's less likely to fixate and stick.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, and something to be practiced. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, and absolutely. And I think one of the things about practice as well is that it is just that. We often say that, even empathy is a practice. It's not something you just get an idea and you decide, okay, that's what I'm going to do, and you can just do it. It's, one is going to constantly be intending and practicing and very often failing. It's not something that just comes ready-made and in a box and you just open it up and do it. It's a practice, a little bit like a muscle. So similarly, I often use the analogy like going to the gym or doing a sport. You can practice for a whole long time and you become very accomplished at it. But if you stop, it very quickly kind of, the muscles weaken and the ability to do whatever it is kind of diminishes or fades away. So it's something that one wants to keep practicing, keep making that choice to do it in that particular way. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I understand, Katherine, that we've already brushed upon a little on this, but since the topic today is self-empathy, it would be nice if you could shed some more light on how self-empathy helps one be more empathic with others.
Yeah. So the thing, one of the kind of almost tricky things about empathy is that when one is empathizing with somebody, there's a lot of things that are going on. The one of which is quite well researched and well known is something called emotional contagion. So when we're attempting to empathize and somebody is expressing strong emotions or something, there's like a contagious picking up of some of those emotions. But maybe a little bit of sort of technical background, the way in which you have that experience uses kind of neurons. They talk about the nervous system, so things in your body that are very similar if you're having an experience or if you're observing it in somebody else. And what that means is sometimes we can confuse. So somebody's having experience and then we have a similar experience to it. It's quite difficult to actually know who's the origin of the experience. Was it my own or was it the other person? So if you suddenly, I see your smiley, happy face and it makes me smiley and happy.
Yeah.
It's hard to know, did it start from you? Did it start from me? So is it your experience or is it my experience? So, and particularly if we have like biases and preconceptions and our own past life experiences that makes us see the world in a particular kind of way, you can start to get confusion of the overlap between yourself and the other person. And so that's when projections start to happen. So self-empathy helps you to actually know what is your contribution, to become aware of it, to name it, to make sense of it, and then you can be more open, more available to empathize with another person. It also is when you bring your, so one of the other things is that we tend to be very outward focused. So we tend to focus on things out in the world. And it's almost like our own experiential world can become quite constricted. It's like all the focus, technology and movies and entertainment and stress and whatever it might be. When you empathize with self, you're actually opening up a space inside of you for experience. And in that process, you open up space for yourself, but you also open up space for the other person.
That's interesting. Interesting. It's also very interesting. It's something new that I learned, that, you know, there's this confusion between the who's experiencing, who started the experience of whatever that feeling is. It's thank you for the insight.
Yeah, absolutely.
With self-empathy, Katherine, what practical outcomes do you see self-empathy helping with? Is self-empathy, for instance, useful in personal relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, one of the things that is, well, there's sort of two focuses. The one is on self. For us, the intention is not particularly on self and the outcomes in self. That's almost like a kind of a handy side effect. But relationships, you know, I would say that self-empathy in relation to empathy with others can impact all relationships. So personal, work relationships, relationships, you know, with children, with any type of relationship. And how that works is that when you're empathizing with self, we often don't know how we come across to other people. So we might have a certain feeling, or you know, think we're coming across in a certain kind of a way, and that can be difficult for people around us. They might see us coming across in a different way. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where someone says, "But you're doing this," and you say, "No, I'm not doing that." You know, it's like, "But you're being critical." No, I'm not being critical. I'm just, you know, I'm just explaining something. And so we often don't know how we come across.
Right.
With self-empathy, you're becoming more aware of your inner life, which then has an expression through your body language. Everything you feel inside has an outer expression. So it can, on the one hand, help you to know how you're coming across and to maybe moderate that or change that. It also creates the space for you to empathize with the other person. And so then if you're understanding them better, you know, then I think it's a win-win.
Right.
Yeah.
So when one is listening without the intention of responding or being triggered, and there is an openness that shows up in that, is what I gather. And it also takes effort to do that. So there is a sense of generosity in, say, listening empathically. And there's a lot that we have to learn from you in this respect, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
I would love to know how the experience of working in the field of empathy has impacted your life, and maybe not just you, but also people around you, your family, your friends, your relationships with people, and yeah, how does your work impact your life and your happiness?
Yeah. So Isha, I'm just wondering, I saw a question popped up on the screen. I'm wondering whether we should respond to that now or whether we should wait until later.
Sure, we can respond to it right now.
And then we can come back to your question.
Definitely. So, Mr. Sriram Kumar is confidence in oneself and one's ability a prerequisite for self-empathy? That's a good question.
That's a really good question, yes, and interesting. So I would say that it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg situation. What comes first? And while confidence can be useful, I would say that self-empathy can also absolutely help you to work with maybe a lack of confidence. So, you might have a certain experience, a difficult experience, you don't quite know what it is. And then by either practicing self-empathy or having someone coach you or guide you through a process of self-empathy, you could start to recognize, I'm lacking in confidence here, or and then if you were to go deeper, most of these experiences have different layers, and you could go deeper into what is that experience when I'm lacking in confidence, and understand more about what that is. And in that process, it would enable a development of confidence potentially. So I would say it's not a prerequisite to do it. It might impact how you do it, but absolutely it can be a way of encouraging confidence in oneself.
Interesting. Thank you for your questions, Sriram, and thank you for answering that right away, Katherine.
Yeah. So would you, if I remember correctly, you asked me how my work with empathy has impacted my life.
Yeah.
My work and also my relationships, or my sort of circle of life. Yeah. So, I mean, I've been working with empathy now since about 2003. It's when I first developed an interest. And I would say that, so it's been through quite a long process. I did a coaching training for 4 years, which was based on empathy. And then I did some research as a master's and PhD related to empathy. I would say probably one of the kind of main impacts is that it feels like my life work. So it's given me very much a passion. So, my work is my life and my life is my work, even though I do have a lot of other interests as well, but it's a very central focus of my life. And it's also opened up I'm able to do a lot of the things that I love doing. So I love writing, I love researching, I love working with people. So this topic and this context kind of gives me that very full opportunity in terms of my work. It gives me a passion. It's what I like about it is that it's like an ongoing learning. So I'm constantly reading, observing people, observing myself, renewing my understanding. It's like from that point of view, it's really given me a lot of satisfaction. In terms of relationships, I would say it's definitely helped to deepen relationships. Not necessarily easier. When you decide to empathize or to attempt to empathize and you don't always get it right, it's almost like you've committed to working through things. And as you know, relationships are tricky. They have many facets, understanding people, but all in a very good way. So I think it makes it a lot more fulfilling. And deepens intimacy, deepens connection. I think it's hard to live a superficial life when you sort of open yourself up to this kind of way of being.
Right.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's in fact aspirational. The fact that your work is your life and your life is your work, and this ignites one big passion in your life other than all the other things that you already like to do. I think
Yes.
everybody would want to be in a profession where they feel this way, and I wish everybody find their calling and are able to do it. Sriram says, "Thank you, Dr. Katherine, for the insight." Thank you for your question, Dr.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah. It's nice to have a little bit of an insight of who's out there listening and watching.
Yes.
Yeah.
To all our audiences, if you have any questions, do pop up. If we want, we will take it in the middle of the conversation, or we can always take it at the end of the show as well, if we have the time for it. So, Professor Jagdish Khatri wants to ask: does empathy need better emotional intelligence first? Would you like to answer that question?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Professor, for that question. You know, I think again, for me, it's that chicken and egg situation, because through practicing empathy, one is developing an emotional intelligence, and particularly if you work that, you know, at encouraging, you know, self empathy and a self awareness in the process. So I absolutely see empathy as a practice and as an ongoing practice, and in that process, one is working with emotions, one is becoming more aware of emotions, and so one is stretching that capacity to develop one's emotional intelligence in the process. And then as one develops that emotional intelligence, absolutely it will help with one's practice of empathy. But again, I feel that it's not like you achieve one and then you suddenly do the other. For me, it is all about the process of exploring, developing each of these capacities, which require a certain awareness of self and a certain awareness of other people. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the answer and also the question, Professor. Can you, Catherine, tell us a little about the backstory of empathic intervision? We need to hear about it. What does an empathic intervision do?
Yeah, so in terms of backstory, I can tell you a little bit about what we do now, and then I can also tell you a little bit about how we came about. And so have practiced and researched empathy for some time. Then I actually had a really chance and interesting meeting with my current partner and co-founder, who is Dr. Lidewij Niezink. She's in France, she's from the Netherlands. We've met really a handful of times face to face, but work almost daily together on the internet. She also been working a long time with empathy from more of an academic background than what I have. I have more of a practitioner background. And she was invited to run a project in South Africa with a very large NGO here, and wanted somebody here in South Africa on the ground who would have some kind of cultural understanding. And so she asked me if I would join her. And through that project, we did a three-year intervention and research project. And it was about developing this process that we now call empathic intervision. So what happened was, through the process, working with the clients, we developed the material in a way that was relevant to them and researched it, and we had some good results, some success with the project. And at that time, we were actually calling it collegial empathic peer support process. So it was about a peer support process. It was for health practitioners and social practitioners working with sick patients. And it was a process for this employees to support each other empathically. At the same time, Lidewij was familiar with, but I became aware of intervision as a known process. So it's something that's used quite extensively in the Netherlands. And it's a peer-to-peer learning and support process, which traditionally it may apply empathy, but it's not an overt part of the process. And we really saw an opportunity for our, what was called SEPs at that time, to link up with intervision. And so empathic intervision was born started 6 years ago, but that name came about, I think, about 3 years ago. And what it is it looks at 5 elements of empathy. So there's self-empathy, then there's kinesthetic empathy, which is about movement between people. So it's more of just the body language element. So empathizing through movement, through being aware of other people's movement. Then there's reflective empathy, which is about listening, really being able to listen and hear people. Imaginative empathy, which is using imagination to put yourself into the perspective of other people. And then empathic creativity, which is about gathering insights into action. Yeah, so that is what it is. And at the moment we train in the 5 elements, which we call integrative empathy. And we also train facilitators who would then go out and facilitate groups or teams or individual people through those steps.
Right. Okay. Great initiative. And going for the past 6 years, that's very nice.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned the story behind the name Intervision, because it's funny. Well, the thing is that whenever I happen to type the word Intervision, more often than not, it is auto-corrected to either intermission or intervention. So intervision is not a very commonly used word in English, I suppose. And yeah, I wanted to ask how you came up with that. And so yeah, it's good that I
Yeah.
asked now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's not used in the English language. I think I came across one other book with some English language people who also recognize the value of it. And so I think, well, they certainly have an intention to introduce it into the English language and practice. And I think also that, the way things are going in business with human-centered design and co-creation, design thinking, all these modalities that are looking at a more kind of peer-to-peer co-creation, co-innovation, all these kind of co-processes. It absolutely is about, rather than a very hierarchical process in an organization, to have more of a peer-to-peer interaction amongst people.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I think in a conversation earlier with you, we also talked about the words intervision and then supervision, and how what you do is not supervision, as in when you're doing the peer-to-peer interaction, it's more about, everybody being on the same plane, no matter what the hierarchy in there, say, for example, if it is an office space, no matter what the hierarchy in the office space is. Yeah. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So you might find in, there is a place for management and hierarchy in certain, functions. And then there's also a place for peer-to-peer. And so if one is doing an empathic intervision process, the managers or the people who might be sort of in a different hierarchical structure will be guided and coached through, actually, as they step into that process, to let go of their hierarchical role and to actually be able to engage peer-to-peer in this process. Yeah.
Okay. So I heard you mention in a previous question, in an answer to a previous question, that you really enjoy your work, and the fact that it is one of your passions now. So it gives you joy. I would like to know, what in this field, in working in this field, what is it that excites you the most?
I think that maybe the thing that troubles me the most in the world is this very strong polarization that's happening in many different, whether it's politics, whether it's relationship. I think a kind of quite a strong tendency to polarize, to go one way or another, and then often to argue things, and you almost entrench your position even further. So I think what for me is exciting as an opportunity is that, how can one find a way to build bridges? So it's something I know that is being spoken about quite a lot. And whether it's in an organization and, you're helping people to find a middle ground or to find a best way of doing something, whether it's in a conflict situation, whether it's been between, parents and children, is how to bridge that polarization. I think that's, probably what really inspires me to kind of keep going is, I think there is a potential, and yeah, it's how to actually bring that about.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, I hear the word polarization, and there also seems to be some polarization in the field of empathy itself, or the field, this, not empathy maybe, but then this field of work. There is a viewpoint of case against empathy. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So, I think that maybe the first thing to say is that there are a lot of different experiences that fall under the kind of the umbrella of empathy. Different people define it differently. Different people describe different experiences. And then there also are a lot of experiences that actually are a part of empathy. So it really depends a lot on how you're interpreting, what you mean by empathy. So there are things like personal distress. When one is empathizing, if the experience that you're empathizing with is causing distress, then you would experience personal distress or empathic distress, or it could be empathic concern. So a lot of these different things that fall under empathy. I think for me, my understanding of it is that when people are speaking against, or one of the understandings against empathy is that it can be that, it's people are experiencing empathic distress or personal distress. And so too much empathy, if it is in the context of personal distress, then can't be good for people. I think the other thing that perhaps is a point is that empathy in itself is neutral. Empathy doesn't, what I mean when I say that is empathy doesn't ensure that a person is going to do good or going to do something helpful. You can apply empathy and understand somebody very deeply, but then have the intention to do something that is harmful to them or manipulative. Or so again, people might, if they're talking against empathy, they might also be referring to this element of empathy. So I think that, first of all, really an understanding of what you mean when you're referring to empathy, and also that, yes, empathy with bad intentions, can have quite destructive outcomes. So I think it's really important that those are considered in the whole debate on empathy. So again, that's why we always work very actively with intentions, empathy with intentions, empathy as a means to an end, empathy with morality, a whole lot of other different considerations. See, there's quite a lot of, I'm just seeing, hi, will empathy differ from relationship to relationship, or is it innate and uniform? Yeah, that is an interesting question. So there's a process of empathy. There are things that one would do when one is empathizing. There are various processes. So, you might choose to connect through emotion with somebody. You might choose to listen to a person. You might choose to imagine their perspective. So depending on how you apply these different elements, the process could be different. you also, depending on the relationship, you're going to understand different things. You're going to come up against possibly different challenges. You might have different biases. You might have, a whole lot of things that are inherent to the relationship. So I would say in the practice, it's going to be very different from person to person, relationship to relationship. There are certainly elements that are uniform and innate. Yes, I would say so.
Okay. There's another question from Mr. Ankur. Thank you, Mr. Yashi, for your question. How to deal with the situations where colleagues take empathy as sympathy?
That is a very interesting question. Yeah, and thank you for that. So, look, I think it's, it depends a little bit on the context and what is your role in relation to those colleagues. Yeah, I think, one would want to know a little bit more about the actual context before saying definitely this is the recipe. But I do believe it's important to educate the differences. So to gain an understanding for oneself of what the difference is, and then also to educate. If you're a coach or an HR manager in an organization, you might have a kind of a vehicle or capacity or a mandate, in a sense, to do that. It can be useful in a sensitive way to highlight what you're observing. Yeah, not sure if that's helpful, but yeah. But very, very, very frequently the two are confused, and sympathy is often kind of considered. Just broadly, the difference is empathy. One is kind of more neutral and looking into the feelings of another person. Sympathy is actually feeling with them or sharing in the experiences.
Feeling with them, what do you mean by that?
So again, if you look at the root of the words, so empathy is going into the experience of another person. With sympathy, you're more with them. So sim is similar.
Okay.
Together.
Yeah. Okay. I see that Mr. Sriram has another question. He says, in today's world, where it is easy to find people with one's own point of view or tribe, as they like to call it, are we finding empathy easier to overlook? Thank you for your question, Mr. Sriram, again.
Thank you for your question. Yes. Yeah, I think probably. So perhaps again, part of this polarization is where we're getting a lot of confirmation for our own biases and for our own, as you say, tribes. And one's definitely seeing a tendency where it is more difficult to engage with the perspective of another person who is outside of your tribe or in an out group, and kind of to see them as wrong, rather than that ability to recognize the difference. Empathy doesn't mean that you need to agree, but you recognize that you understand it from their perspective. And a consequence of that can be that you hold a space. There's a space for that difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering that question as well.
Pleasure.
So, yeah, thank you, Mr. Ankur, for your question. So, moving on to a question, because I see there is no other question right now popping up from the audience, which was already a lot of fun because it was so interactive. So I heard you mention earlier that presence and holding space go hand in hand. What does that mean?
Yeah, so what I mean by presence is an ability to be present And in this context, it's an ability to be present to one's inner life and experience and thoughts and feelings. So there can be a tendency, particularly in a very sort of tech and fast life, that you're physically present, but you're not really emotionally and mentally present. And so by presence, I mean that ability to be here with one's thoughts, feelings, and emotions and experience. So in terms of holding space, what one is doing through holding space is one is creating presence for another person. So it requires a certain ability for presence in order to hold space for somebody else. And through holding space, one is creating presence for the other in their experience, thoughts, and feelings.
Okay. I see that Mr. Sriram just said thank you, Katherine.
Yes.
Holding the space, that's my takeaway from the response. Incredible.
Yeah. He almost preempted you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Katherine, how does one know if they're holding space for the other?
So my question would be, how does who know? So it could be the person that you're empathizing with. Do they know? Yeah, that's again a very, very, very interesting question, because you as the empathizer might feel that you're holding space,
Right.
but if it's not relevant for the person that you're empathizing with and they don't experience it, the question is, are you holding space? So I would say that, yeah, for me, it's with empathy, there's this ongoing kind of, it's not just a thing that you do and it's done and it's finished. It's an ongoing process. So a process of being in a particular way and then observing what is the response. A very interesting thing in our African culture is that making eye contact in I come from a British background. Making eye contact is considered to be polite, and it means that I'm engaging with you in an equal way. But in many of the African cultural contexts, if you make eye contact, it's actually rude. So it's polite to actually slightly lower your gaze. So if I think I'm being very engaging with you and I'm looking you dead in the eye, and you are of an African cultural background, it might be very rude for you. So it's about being sensitive. So reading the situation, doing something, being sensitive to the response, and being able to moderate one's processes. So yes, I would say it's holding space if the person feels held in the space.
Okay, that's tricky.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So Mr. Ankur says, as a country manager in an MNC, we have a mandate to inculcate empathy. What should be our first step towards it?
Yeah. So I think that what's really important is that the culture of the company is open to it, and that you create a space for it. So there's certain. I think it would be difficult for me to go into the kind of the absolute steps now. I could, if you would like to communicate with us via our website, we can also open up a conversation about that. But you would want, it's really important that the upper management, that the culture of the organization is receptive to that type of interaction amongst people. Then there is also, it can be trained. So there's training processes that one could take the staff through. It's also, from our experience, it requires some routines in an organization where, meetings where there's free for all or where people are not properly listening to each other is not going to inculcate empathy. But if there's certain routines that are introduced into your, for example, your meeting processes, where there's a proper listening structure, where there's a proper reflecting back structure, where, so I would say definitely the culture would want to embrace it. The management would want to be role modeling certain aspects of empathic behaviors. And then also on a routine and structure level, one would want to have those things in place so that you can actually make sure that the practice happens.
Okay, there's another question. Hi. Thank you, Mr. Yashi, for your question. Hi. Sorry for this naive question, but bosses at workplace fake empathy? Do bosses at workplace fake empathy? Is what he wants to ask.
So I would say you can definitely fake. You can absolutely fake practices that are supposed to be empathic. Whether you're actually understanding a person through that process, I would say that you can't fake. You either have an understanding or you don't. I'm sure people can fake.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. But, if a person doesn't feel, if the person being empathized with doesn't feel that it's empathic, then the fake, the attempts have then failed. So.
Yeah. Even if the attempts are not fake, if they're very real, but it just does not get communicated to the person who wants to feel empathy from you.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, like we talked earlier.
Yeah.
Space part. Okay, so learning about empathy, Catherine, and starting to practice compassion, according to me, is a continuous process. And I believe what you do is not only helpful for adults, but also has the potential to impact young minds to become more compassionate individuals. So, what do you think about this? Do you think self empathy, in particular, can be applied in early childhood?
So I think definitely elements of self-empathy. So the way that we practice self-empathy and the kind of practice that we have that we've developed and that we take people through, some of it wouldn't be relevant for very early childhood. And the reason for this is that as the young child develops, so just to say I'm not a childhood development specialist at all, but just from my basic understanding is that very early childhood, children are learning mainly through doing, not through reflecting, not through, they don't have a capacity for emotion naming, for, certain emotional awareness. So there may be a structured process of introducing different exercises, but it certainly wouldn't look like the self-empathy that we would do with adults at the moment. So I think absolutely, the very early elements, one would identify what's relevant for the developmental phase of the child, and those exercises on a simpler level could be, and I think would be very useful to introduce at an early stage. But you don't want to bring too much, emotional awareness too early. So you would hold out until they're developmentally ready for that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
In my experience in India, in a preschool, I organized a workshop where I worked with emotions with them, and just recognizing of emotions was the whole idea of the workshop. So recognizing of emotions and then reflecting on the emotions, and how if they have felt that way in a particular situation, and how the other people felt when um, I try to make it as little complicated as possible and as
Yes,
possible. But I also feel like recognizing emotions is the first step to eventually
yes,
understanding empathy.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah, interesting.
So let us now talk about some of the challenges that come with your profession, and then how do you deal with all of those challenges?
So I
Mhm.
think at the moment, one of the biggest challenges that we are working with is, with COVID. So empathy, we have always worked face to face, and it kind of comes naturally when you're working face to face. And
Mhm.
so with the whole world in lockdown, we've been working for the last year online,
Mhm.
and that's been a very good learning opportunity, but also quite challenging. So definitely there are things that are difficult. There's
Mhm.
things that one can work well with online.
Mhm.
It opens up the world. I probably wouldn't have been doing this interview if not for, we meet a lot more international people, which is great. But yeah, I would say there are some limitations with this work in an online environment. I look forward to working face to face again. Something else is that I think that there's a strong interest in empathy in the world. Um, it is in a lot of sectors still felt to be a soft skill,
Mhm.
um, and so there can be maybe a bit of caution around really going in full stick in an organization. So that can be a challenge.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. What else? Yeah, I
Well,
think those are perhaps the two things that come to mind right now.
yeah, no, that's good enough. That's good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one only finds ways of dealing with the problems as and when they come along. And I'm sure you found some solutions to some, and the other solutions are on their way to you.
Yes. Yes. Hopefully. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see, Catherine, any limitations to empathy? Is it, for example, even possible or sustainable for everyone to be empathic to everyone all the time? It would, also it would give our audience a better insight into this if we hear with if you have any examples to
Yes.
what you
Yes.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I think to start, I don't think you want to be empath. I don't think that life demands of you to be empathic all the time. So a lot of life is just about, kind of doing things in your way. And then there'll be a moment where there's a situation where somebody is requiring to be understood. Might be in an interaction with somebody or a relationship or something. There might be a conflict that comes up or a misunderstanding, or you want to be more relevant to a person and you want to understand them. So I think that, generally in life, one's going about life alongside people, and there is no need. In terms of when one wants to be empathic and one needs to be empathic, and can one all the time, I think it also depends a lot on what you do with that empathy. And so there are two examples that come to mind. And
Okay.
one was where it really wasn't sustainable for this person to be empathic all the time.
Mhm.
And another one was in a person who had really found resources in themselves where they were able to. And I'll describe both of those a little bit.
Mhm.
So both of these actually came up when I was doing my research on empathy and compassion fatigue
Mhm.
and burnout. And the one example was of a person the person was working in a legal situation, and they were coaching people for court. So there would be a legal case, and
Mhm.
that person needed to go to court to give evidence. And so they were being coached as to how they presented themselves in court. And this person was the court coach. And this person really empathized with this one particular client in order to be able to be relevant to that client. What was happening, though, was that the client, the situation that the client, it was actually a minor, so it was a child, and the situation that the client was in court for was related to some childhood abuse that person had experienced, and the legal aid had a similar experience in their own past. And so they felt very strongly about really understanding this minor, this child, and making the best job, because they wanted the abuser, you know, to for the case to be represented well. But it turned out that what came out through the process was that the child was actually misrepresenting the details, and eventually actually acknowledged that they were misrepresenting the details. And because this legal person had empathized so deeply and had put so much energy into the person's job at that time, they were very, very deeply let down by the process. And so the case that we were looking at was around this empathy. The person was so let down to the extent that they actually had to leave work for, I think it was a couple of weeks or a month. And so I would say that in that context, empathizing was, it was undermining the practitioner to the extent that, they actually had a complete collapse. So that's where I think that one really wants to be careful. I think that's where, if empathy is based on self-empathy and one is aware of one's own motivations, why am I so intent on putting so much energy into this situation? One can maybe have a deeper understanding of what's going on, and not put so much energy, so much of their own personal resources into this process. So that's the one case where I think there's a limitation. Another case, which was also, this was in a person who was counseling conflict type situations. And so it was related to marital counseling. And this person had also, interestingly, had similar experiences themselves with their own marriage situation, but they had gone through a very deep self-empathy process themselves, and had uncovered almost, it was actually quite beautiful and quite remarkable, it uncovered incredible resources. And I would say also, kind of spiritual resources. And this person really could empathize in, could work with a lot of people, could empathize very deeply, but was able to maintain their own sense of self in the process. And so then that person had really quite remarkable resources to empathize. So I think one can't generalize. It depends very much on, so this is why for me self-empathy is so important. And really why we put a lot of focus on that self first. Because depending on how you're using your own resources, how you're using your own energy, what you're bringing to the interaction can help to make it more or less sustainable.
Okay. Yeah. So when you use the word resources, it means the inner resources that you have to be able to empathize with the other.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. These were two really incredible stories, and also gave us two aspects to self-empathy and how how we can make it more sustainable for ourselves, right?
Yes.
By recognizing, so yes, that this is where self-empathy comes in.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So it almost goes back full circle to the self-empathy that we started out with.
Okay. I imagine that there are a lot of different organizations that can benefit from benefit from this, and for a lot of different reasons, maybe. And can you give us a few examples of how, say, for example, one could use self empathy in organizations as a manager or within teams, maybe?
Yeah, so interestingly, we're actually working with an organization at the moment, and so unfortunately with COVID, a lot of, the economy has really struggled, and some organizations more so than others. And one organization that we're in contact with has had to lay off a lot of their staff. And so we've had meetings recently with actually the HR director, who is kind of at the front line of this whole process. And so needing to really empathize with the people. So having to lay off, really a significant number of people, and being aware of the impact it's going to have on their lives. And also, each time that person does it, it touches them somewhere in their soul, because, the person is, you can see that they're empathic, and they're experiencing the difficulties that these people are going through. And so for that person to be able to empathize with themselves means that each call, they can call on some resources, they can be aware of, the impact on themselves, and to be able to then find that presence to do the next call and the next call and the next call. Yeah.
Right.
Teams, interestingly, so we do quite a lot of work with co-creation and human-centered design. And where you see it, particularly when there's co-creation, you quite often get dynamics in teams. And if people are wanting to be creative, and some people are more pushy, other people might criticize, and then you very often find one team member might have their feelings hurt or feel criticized or whatever, and react in a particular kind of a way. So an interesting self-empathy exercise that one can do when you're facilitating teams like that is just get everybody to stop, turn around, look at what's going on inside of them, recognize it, name it, and then make a new intention to actually move forward. So to revisit, what are we trying to do here? What's going on? What is your contribution in actually inhibiting this team process? Right. Interestingly, when we were speaking about the kinesthetic empathy as well, another thing one can do is get people to reconnect just through physical movement. So put people in a circle, get them to identify what's the motion, what's happening inside of me, how can I express it with my hands, and then just to synchronize that motion amongst a team, and you can very quickly overcome a block or a kind of a congestion in a team process like that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Katherine, can you tell us where our listeners can learn about self-empathy? Is there a way to reach out to you, or just to learn about self-empathy in general?
Yeah, so interestingly, there isn't a lot of information. If one were to do a Google search, we have done so ourselves, and so not a lot. One can certainly try. If people sign up to our newsletter, we actually offer a free booklet on self-empathy. If they do that, we promise we don't inundate people with newsletters. So people are welcome to look at our website and to download sign up to the newsletter, and then they can get the booklet that we've written on it. We also, we're actually in the process of developing a new course, which will be up and running online quite shortly, which would be a short course on self-empathy. So again, if people are interested, we can keep them updated with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. And the website name is flashing on the screen right now. So anybody who wants to visit and wants more information or wants to get in touch with Katherine or Lidewij can definitely check that
Please
out.
do.
Yeah.
We welcome conversations with people. We're very interested to hear what your particular interests are, what your applications are, and we're always at the end of an email.
Sure. And so, Katherine, I believe that we're almost at the end of our show. We're already over time by 17 minutes or so. So this conversation with you, Katherine, has been very, very insightful, and I feel like our discussion could go on for a while. But of course, we need to come to a reasonable closure. So I would wrap up our conversation with a final question for you. Can you give us a metaphor for empathy, Katherine, or have you ever thought about it?
I've never thought about it before. I'm interestingly quite a literal person, so metaphors, thinking out the box, is not my forte.
You can choose not to the question also. That's also fine. We're suspending
So
judgment.
I think one of the things that seeing that you did forewarn me, one of the things that I think came up for me was I almost see it as like the ground that is receptive, like fertile ground, receptive to a seed, because in a way the ground is creating an environment for the seed to blossom. So for me, I think empathy, I would want it to be a kind of a fertile place for people to blossom. And also there's a sensing that happens between the seed and the ground in order that seed can burst into life. So that was my little creative spurt.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice that I asked you this question. It made you think about metaphor, and it's so nice. So, Katherine, I believe that that big change in the world comes about with efforts of one person at a time, and you definitely are one of those people. So, hats off to the incredible work that you are doing.
Thank you, Isha, and thank you for your really insightful and sensitive interviewing, and to TLR and all the people behind the scenes who've created this opportunity for us to talk, and also to all the listeners who are out there, and to some of those really interesting questions that we were able to answer.
Definitely.
Thank you to all of you.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, everybody, it was a delight, the conversation we had today. And I'm absolutely positive that we all had a very enriching session. Thank you, our audience, for tuning in and sticking around till this time. It's already overtime, so thank you a lot for sticking around. And a big thank you to Dr. Katherine Train for carving out time to be a part of TLR shows. For more information on empathic intervision, please visit the website flashing on the screen below. And for more uplifting and enriching conversations like this one, follow TLR now and stay updated about TLR shows. Thank you again, everybody, for joining in. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.